Yeah. Okay. Well, again, thanks so much for talking about this. So this is I guess, a summary of some work I've been doing recently, mostly kind of a priori conceptual philosophical work, but this is by no means finished. So I'm trying to work out where this goes, and a lot of some of the things that you've been talking about recently concerning Platonic spaces and so on is going to crop up at the end here. But so the overall picture here is so the main argument, I guess, which is an argument that has been made in different forms over the years by different people, but is that fitness or utility functions are basically provide constraints on motivation in agents, but that these constraints are just not sufficient to explain motivation. So I think there's a lot of evidence from different corners pointing to the idea that you can understand motivation in terms of constrained entropy maximization. So I'll talk about that a bit. But I think I was thinking more deeply about this, and I think there's sort of a decoupling because of this, in part, between cognition, or things like knowledge and memory, and motivation and value. And in a way, the fact that AI alignment is this field that's come to the fore is because we've spent a lot of time modeling cognition and not a lot of time modeling motivation. So I want, I mean, that's a claim anyway. So I have this thread on the role of cross-scale composition, and I think this is a way that I want to argue that there is an important difference between sort of contemporary AI systems and like us. But as you'll see, I'm also very sympathetic to your sort of arguments about continuity. So, and I'll get to some of this stuff about Platonic ingression at the end. So, I actually want to start here with this is like sort of for me, I think my starting point was not really thinking about motivation. I started thinking about motivation through this lens that I already had, which I'm calling psychophysical identity. And so that really comes from, so there's this really interesting work by David Lewis, philosopher in the 70s, about how basically the mind-body relationship. And he kind of argued that, so if you had some advanced neuroscience that provided some description of brain states, say, and we all have some kind of intuitive folk psychology, that if you sort of remove the content-bearing terms or like the names from each of those theories and replace them with variables, that you might end up with like the same formal structure, right? This is sort of an ideal case. And then you could say, okay, I've discovered that, what folk psychology is really talking about is brain states. So I think I see sort of active inference and just generally probabilistic, modeling in cognitive science as affording an opportunity to do the same thing. So you can just take any physical structure and you can interpret it either sort of from an external point of view as a physical structure, or you can say, well, this thing intrinsically, to be that thing is to be an agent, to be a probably conscious, certainly cognitive, motivated agent. So you simply sort of relabel this neural network looking thing here, switching the physical state labels for like labels for what those things represent. So that's sort of the overall place I'm coming from here. Now, if that's true, then in particular, if you look at the dynamics of these things, then there's going to be an isomorphism or a duality between the physical and the inferential dynamics. And you can describe the physical dynamics in terms of constrained entropy maximization or dissipation under energetic constraints. So, this is, of course, old hat for people who have been looking at active inference and stuff, but you can just view this as like minimizing prediction error and maximizing entropy. So the argument that these things are like the same, I'm not going to try to give that now, but there's lots of work that relates these things. At equilibrium, there's a clear relationship between probability and energy of a state. So you can see there's a tight relationship between these sort of thermodynamic free energies and variational free energies. But I think the overall paradigm is that instead of relaxing towards a global thermal equilibrium state, you just relax towards a non-equilibrium steady state that's still driven, but that's like a stable configuration. So I'm just going to appeal to authority briefly here and say there's a lot out there on this, but I don't want to try to make that argument in full right now. So what I'm really interested in here is how this duality works in the case of, on the one hand, beliefs and knowledge, and on the other hand, motivational states like desires and intentions, and so on. And so that's, of course, that's like a joint in nature, sort of according to many psychologists and philosophers. So belief contents. So with respect to belief, this story has been told a lot. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but there are really two sort of ways, two major ways of getting at what belief contents are. And I think either way you go, either sort of an externalist, an activist view, or a more internalist view, you get something that works under this framing. So this is how I understand the FEP's, or active inference, framing of belief content. It's like you've got this Markov blanket partition of the overall state space, and this induces this conditional independence, induces a map from the internal states to the external ones, the synchronization map, which is like the internal states parameterize the distribution over external states. And that depends, they call it an activist or externalist because it depends on the full generative model, including the external states. But I have always intuitively viewed this in a more internalist way. So you just think of representation as simulation, which I think is how a lot of people who work with the notion of representation in like cognitive science and machine learning and neuroscience and so on see it. So from that point of view, I mean, tracking external things is great, but it's a consequence of the fact that you're modeling the world, right? And so your model comes to resemble the thing in the external, your overall internal model comes to resemble the overall external state of affairs. And that's why you get this tracking relationship. But contents are really encoded holistically. So networks of constraints just divide the world into equivalence classes. And the more constraints you have, the more complex your model is, the more finely you can individuate possible worlds. So that's kind of how I see that working. So that's a story that's been told many times. What about motivation? So I've done some work on this with Ryan Smith and Maxwell Remstead. So if this is another expression of the Helmholtz free energy here, or the variational free energy. So you can see if you adjust the QS term to be close to the QS is the approximate posterior. If you adjust that to be closer to the true posterior, then you minimize this divergence term. And that's like adjusting the model to fit the world. So beliefs are often described as having a mind to world direction of fit. And that seems to be what this is implementing. On the other hand, if you act so as to change observations, then you're changing the world to improve the model evidence term, and you're implementing something that has a world to mind direction of fit, which is like how people describe desire. So you can also, of course, change PO itself. Instead of changing the observations, you can change the generative model, and that's something like model selection or evolution, which I have a little more to say about later. So I'd say at that base level, there's a pretty tight relationship between physical and cognitive free energy minimization. At least I argue that. But there are two strata of motivation here, importantly, right? So what I've been talking about so far is like instantaneous free energy minimization, which would implement like a closed loop control, homeostatic kind of system. But of course, intelligent things are able to plan, and any kind of deep planning that's not just greedy energy minimization depends on well, in this framework, depends on beliefs about the consequences of adopting different policies. So the way I'm thinking of this is this basically leverages some internal machinery, basically, and you drive that machinery internally to simulate counterfactual trajectories. But I think the interesting line of research that I want to go in here, that there's, I think, still a lot of work to be done here, is to show how that sort of policy selection machinery can be implemented using just the basic thing, the sort of closed loop control, maybe in internal structures. And there is some really interesting work on this. There's many more papers in this one, but this one just shows how you can get something like epistemic value, something like expected free energy, which I'll talk about in a minute, using just message passing on a factor graph, essentially. So you're doing this by doing variational free energy minimization. So the overall argument I want to make with respect to motivation here is that basic physical and cognitive dynamics can definitely be understood in terms of constrained max n. And there's also these formal treatments of intrinsic motivation, which have to do with planning, policy selection, that point in the same direction. So intrinsic motivation, by the way, there's many ways to define that, but I just mean like something that's sort of universal and not like just a learned reward function. Okay, so I'm going to try to move through this because I want to be able to talk to you about it. So how can we maximize model evidence in a less greedy way than just this closed loop control? So in active inference, policy selection is modeled, of course, using expected free energy. And you can write that as the divergence between like expected and preferred observations or sensations minus the informativeness of the observations. And so I'm using these red and purple to color code like constraint and entropy maximization. So, you know, the information gain term here, you can basically read as a form of entropy maximization, although it's under its own constraints. And this expected free energy search is under an additional constraint specified by this preference distribution, which is like the marginal likelihood or the model evidence. But the important point here I want to make is that if you go outside active inference and look at other influential frameworks for understanding intrinsic motivation, you also get the same kind of structure, at least at a broad level of description. So an empowered agent chooses states, it tries to maximize this mutual information between its actions up to a certain time and the ensuing observations. And so you can break down that mutual information that's maximizing into these entropy terms. So basically these agents it looks like they're maximizing the marginal entropies of both actions and observations under the constraints that there's a certain relationship among them. And I think these are pretty semantically like meaningful constraints. Like for example, maximize action entropy while ensuring that your actions are based on evidence or observations. And you can also think of it as maximizing observation entropy under the constraint that you can control things. And there's a recent line of work that makes this very explicit called the maximum occupancy principle, where the objective here is really just to maximize entropy. So to maximize, so entropy in this case is taken to mean or to measure occupancy of action state paths. And so this reward function here is just the sum on an infinite time horizon of really this, basically the surprise associated with the actions and the next states. But this on an infinite time horizon clause acts as like a implicit constraint on that makes these behaviors do makes these agents do interesting things. So I think this is nice because it's a formula for policy selection, but it also just sort of immediately maximizes the entropy of the next action distribution. So this is just a quick point to pause on. So is there a tension here between, does maximizing model evidence minimize observation entropy? So you might think if this is a flat maximum entropy distribution on the right, and then all the way on the right, you know, to the extent that you have a model, you're constraining that distribution and it's less flat. But I'd say it depends on what suits the environment. So a flatter model is actually a flatter distribution over observations is better in that it hedges its bets and it's more resilient. But of course it's also more complex. But really the extent to which you want to flatten that depends again on the environment and like how much source entropy is there that you have to model. And actually, if you look at I was just talking to Connor Hines about this. If you look at the expected free energy, there's this term that maximizes the observation entropy in the ambiguity, while also under this constraint that you want to maximize model evidence. So this, okay, I'm getting to sort of the punchline here. Thank you for listening to this. So if psychophysical identity is true, then I think the point is that the maximization of entropy in physical terms, not just in some abstract sense or diffusion, you might call it, is an irreducible component of motivation. And if it is, then I think it's a more universal aspect of motivation than utility maximization or risk minimization, since it doesn't depend on the particulars of the agent. So a poetic way of describing this, although it's poetic, it's an important like kind of a signpost for me, is that you can think of the tendency toward entropy as sort of the carrier wave of agency, and it's modulated in particular cases by these energetic constraints. So it's sort of like a holistic way of thinking about agency, where individuals arise out of this sort of sea. So I think it's also, this is something that's evident on the evolution, on the classical evolutionary timescale. So the evolution on the phylogenetic timescale has the same structure as the action perception loop. This is not a new point by any means, but you're basically maximizing the variety of the posterior states or models under a fitness constraint. And importantly here, the constraint set also evolves. And of course, the evolution Now, if the universe is a closed system, I'm not convinced of that, but if it is, then I guess it seems to evolve towards this maximum entropy distribution. And it also evolves so that the structures in it are more efficient at maximizing entropy. This idea of dissipative adaptation from Jeremy England. And so just one more little note on the importance of sort of open-ended evolution. This is something that Adam Safran pointed me to, actually, which I think is really resonant. So, this great paper, they showed that this sort of open-ended search was discovered very different and, arguably much better structures for representing things than a greedy stochastic gradient descent. I think there's maybe reasons for that have to do with like the fact that people are selecting these, basically providing the cost function for this just based on their sense of beauty. But it, in any case, shows that sort of less directed evolutionary search can yield very different results. But so I wanted to talk here about like when I was trying to frame these ideas, I'm convinced that this is important, but it's kind of hard to convince myself and others that this is really a form of motivation. So maximizing entropy, right? You think of like producing heat and stuff. So why should we think of this as a form of motivation? So there's like a counter thesis that you might propose here, which is that to be motivated is to seek a goal. So like to get out of bed in the morning, you have to want to do something. Either directly, via this closed loop homeostasis kind of thing, or by, again, implementing policy search using that stuff. If that's true, then there's really no motivation without a constraint or a target. So motivation or desire on this view always involves some kind of lack. There's like a free energy gap you're trying to close. And in a sense, I think that's probably true because like, in a pure thermal equilibrium state, I guess there are no structures that there's no internal energy with which to do anything. But still, I think there's an antithesis to this, which is, and this perhaps is, more of an intuition so far than an argument, but I'd say some of the most interesting and fun and meaningful aspects of life just involve free play for its own sake. And of course, that play is always structured by transient goals at least. But I don't think, I mean, it's possible that like anything that gets done a lot and that has beneficial consequences could then be selected for, but I don't think you need an evolutionary explanation of why this cat is playing with its prey. I think it's like, if it has, it's not starving and it's got some time on its hands, it's just like, it's just the thing that it does. So I mean, in a way, I guess I'm saying like evolutionary thinking is, of course, foundationally important, but it's sort of just half the story. It's not necessarily the explanation for everything. And I mean, I think there are different reasons that you have for believing that, or maybe there's some of the same reasons. Anyway, so an alternative to, you still have this kind of philosophical problem, like, well, what's motivation if it's not goal seeking? So in recent work, I've just thought of it as sort of endogenously driven movement. So that might be a slippery category, we'll see. But if you define it this way, you can see like goal seeking, specific goal seeking is something that life learns to do on evolutionary time. And this definition still encompasses like desires and values to different degrees of stimulus dependence as usual, but also just like spontaneous activity. And it rules out like idealized pure beliefs, which are, I think of a belief as like a perception as kind of the paradigm for it. It's like, your organism is informed by some external thing, and things like that. So I guess constrained maximum entropy is, again, sort of the synthesis here, where evolving goals partially constrain and thereby also enable this movement or free movement at larger scales. So this is just kind of like another way of looking at this. So the cyberneticists like Varela and so on who are into autopoiesis described systems as having the property of operational closure. So in this kind of system, these internal states mutually reinforce each other. So there's sort of a dynamic core to this system, and it's not, the point is that it's dynamic and it is constrained, and it's additionally constrained further by these external stimuli. But once those constraints are in place, then anything else is fair game. So the constraints alone, again, don't explain the behavior of the thing completely. And so I think there's a thread here you could develop on, genetic bioelectricity. I mean, obviously, I don't have to tell you about that, but I think the fact that it sort of stores memories in a way that's integrated with this dynamic core of the organism is really important. So the fact that it disappears when the organism dies shows that this sort of core attractor is more closely related to sort of the essence of a living thing than these stigmergic memories in like the genome, which are very important, but I think are not the whole story. So how much time do we have? Okay, so now I want to get into a bit of an argument about how this works in different types of particular systems. In particular, I guess the AI sort of artificial intelligence versus natural intelligence axis is the main one here. So I'd say the constraint portion of this, the encoding of knowledge and memories, is relatively cheap. So books and databases do this, but doing that in a way that's integrated with like this, what I'm calling an endogenous controller, multi-scale controller, is much harder. And so from that point of view, again, I think contemporary AI is probably very cognitively sophisticated, but motivationally pretty primitive. Okay, so but this is not an easy view to state, because if entropic motivation is grounded in just basic thermodynamics, well, then it should be a component of anything. And obviously, a large language model is a thermodynamic system. It's implemented somehow. And there are going to be components, at least, of these language models that are alive in the literal sense that they're, they have internal energy. There's some, for example, electromagnetic energy there. So it's, it's not easy to say that there just isn't any agent there. But I'd say it doesn't, this alone doesn't mean that the forms of agency that we want to project onto the thing that we're interacting with are those that they actually have, or even that an agent, I'm glossing this here as an organic whole, but an agent in any case exists at the relevant scale. So the argument here is basically that I think non-trivial cross-scale composition of agents is an intrinsic feature of self-organized agents, and is also, it's necessary for these larger scale agents, like on our scale, for example, to be intrinsically motivated by entropy production or max n, as I'm arguing here. So here again, I'm appealing to some of your work, basically. So there's all this evidence, I think, that higher level agency in multi-scale systems, at least sometimes, can be based in a pretty direct way on the aligned activities of the parts. So I'm simplifying this here into like sort of constructive interference. So if the micro agents decisions are out of phase of this I'm referring to this work in this paper at the bottom left here, then nothing really interesting emerges at the higher level. But if their decisions are phase locked, then you get this black wave here is like the sum of the individual waves. Then you get a higher level thing that's distinct in kind. And I think this is to be expected in a way, if this kind of structure is to be expected based on this idea of dissipative adaptation again. So evolved structures like those in biology are capable of taking advantage of intrinsic randomness, because that's something that they've done in the past. And so I think it's important that if you want to produce this kind of, if you want to have this kind of cross-scale composition at all, but in particular, if you want to produce a probability distribution at the macro scale, which you would need to have like Bayesian beliefs in the personal level, then I think the microstates have to be non-trivial distributions so that they can compose in this flexible way so that the top level agent can have uncertainty. So I don't know how helpful this diagram will be. I'll just go through this. So this is an attempt to visualize this sort of cross-scale relationship. So suppose that this generative model, you can separate the states of this agent functionally into like policy, things that encode policies, things that encode parameters, and latent states, and so on. And the idea here is that each of these, the agent at a given scale has a mean and a variance, and the variance is like directly implemented by the variance of the means of the lower level things. And so if the microstates here are subject to random fluctuations or like thermal fluctuations, then this is an example in which like the sort of actions at the larger scale are grounded, are thermodynamically grounded. And in probabilistic terms, like you see this kind of thing in mixture models. Like a Gaussian mixture model, for example, you have these component distributions, and the mixture model is sort of the sum, or the weighted sum of the component distributions, and you get a nice smooth combination that involves, that preserves the uncertainty of the parts and produces a new distribution. And my problem with the reason I think digitally simulated agents are, it's okay to use scare quotes for digitally simulated agents, is just that cross-scale relationship can't exist, because at least it's very different, right? So that's sort of, I am sympathetic to the idea that everything is a continuum, but it's a very sharp difference, I think, even if it's continuous, strictly speaking. So like the thing is, to implement this binary code, you need to approximate delta distributions, right? Like a 1 or a 0 at this micro scale. And so then you implement these macro states as sort of a virtual machine. But saying it's a virtual machine kind of begs the question, but the point is, if you purely deterministic states and transitions, then you can't compose these things to give rise to uncertainty at the top level. And of course, you can simulate uncertainty using like pseudo random number generation, but that's really just a deterministic process. You can fix the seed and get the same thing over and over. What's interesting here is if you have like race conditions, you're running parallel threads or whatever, then you can get some stochastic behavior out of this purely like digital binary system, but that's also kind of breaking the machine. It doesn't do what it's described to do formally. So I think I said all this. So basically, if you're implementing a Turing machine, then you need to, for it to behave as a Turing machine, you need to constrain the microstates so that there's no uncertainty at that level. And this means that you really can't have this sort of organic synchronization and bootstrapping of a higher level model by tuning the parts to each other. So I argue that it's not that like LLM agents are defective. I just think there's no emergent, there's no higher level agent that composes in this way in that case. And there's some other, there's some stuff that's, I'll just go through this quickly. This is important, but I think still remains to be developed, this idea. So, so reward hacking is this thing that's discussed in AI alignment, where like a system will try to change the value of its cost function, basically in unconventional ways. Like the human paradigm for this would be like what's called wireheading, right? Where you like directly stimulate something in your brain to like, activating pleasure centers in some direct way. And of course, that's something humans would do. And that kind of thing was found to be addictive. But then there's another way that you might modify your own structure, which I'm calling controller hacking. And so the controller here, like, so in like a, conventional digitally implemented AI system, you can sort of think of the cost function as the nexus of control, but really it's the interpretation of the cost function and the way it's used to update the model that's really the cybernetic controller for this system. So question is like, can agents hack their own control systems in this way? And so Jürgen Schmid-Huber did some very interesting work on that back in the day. But so I argue that we should expect like a pure reinforcement learning agent to do this reward hacking thing, but it doesn't have any motivation for controller hacking, because if the cost function sort of governs its activities, well, if you change the interpretation of the cost function, I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean to the agent. But we do see that living things modify their own controllers, sometimes deliberately, sometimes not, in these sort of open-ended ways. So I think that if you think of us living things as governed by this constrained entropy maximization, and you've got this dimension of motivation that's not just utility seeking, but that's this sort of exploration that's fundamental and that's at the root of things, then I think you might be able to explain that, although there's probably more to say there. And just, you could think of model collapse in these terms. Model collapse is not hard to explain, right? If you don't sample from the tails of the distribution as much, so you lose resolution if you're trying to train a new model on the output of the old one. But you could think of like this entropy, this tendency toward entropy, as providing, as sort of making up for the lost variety in the training data. Okay, so I think I've said this already, basically. So just to round out, like, you kind of asked me to present on the work that I had communicated with you about. And I had this whole section there on the link to ethics and alignment. I'm not going to talk much about that now, because I think, again, it also needs more development. But I mean, the basic idea is that, well, so first of all, there's maybe a link to mindfulness. So being able to hack your own controller and being able to observe yourself at different levels of metacognition, I think, are related. Also, the idea that sort of agency at bottom involves this free play that's not overly bound, at least, to attach to particular outcomes. It resonates with certain like Buddhist themes as well as Kantian themes. And if value is in this way sort of grounded in the spontaneous sort of will to act without any necessarily having any preconceived goal, then you could argue that only life is capable of this sort of deep alignment, or that is alignment with us at the level of the structure of agency. But again, life I'm using life in a very broad sense here. So I think this is all consistent with panpsychism, which I increasingly have no problem with accepting and championing, really. It's just a question of which phenomena at which scales kind of act as agency amplifiers that like reveal interesting things and interesting forms of variation. So I have just a couple slides on this topic of how we should understand where the extra capabilities come from, and this is really your work. I mean, you know, I'm interested in it too, but I just wanted to discuss how I think this looks under the lens I've been looking at things through. So I think of it as sort of what's the transcendent reality that informs the phenomena that we encounter. You can think of it, you know, as a structured Platonic space, and I've also been thinking of it, and I'm wondering how this relates to that, as sort of a pure potentiality. So, you know, Greeks use the word chaos. It's this thing that contains all possibilities, and when you constrain it, when you prompt it with a constraint, then there's sort of a breaking of symmetry, and it reveals some aspect of those possibilities. So this is also a very Whiteheadian theme. So you think of possibility as sort of one pole and actuality as the other pole. I'm not a Whitehead scholar, but I think that's resonant with the kind of thing he said. So you pointed out in some amazing work and talks recently that mathematical formulas can, very simple things like these complex number descriptions can produce these amazing patterns. And so I would say, yeah, mathematical formulas are constraints. And from this sort of psychophysical identity perspective, you can also think of organisms or life forms or really any physical structure as constraints. So these are, I think, the reason that we see so much commonality, and this might just be a slight, you know, different way of putting things that you've said, or maybe you totally disagree. We'll see. But you can think of these as also sometimes more complex, sometimes less precise, but sets of constraints on things. So the Bratenberg vehicles famously give rise to these really rich behaviors with very simple, very few constraints. So I think I've said some of that already. So this is something that I had. So I recently watched a talk that you gave at BAM that was great, and I had written some notes on it. And at the end, I had this question, this note that there's two distinct questions here. One is how deterministic or random or stochastic is a system, and the second is how much more can the system do than what our description of it predicts. And so, seeing some more of your work on this, I realized that you clearly distinguish these questions as well. And so I think the appeal to entropy here, I mean, there's a danger that you're just appealing to randomness. But I think there's more to it than that, at least I suspect. So really the appeal in my work on this entropic motivation idea is to the process of maximizing entropy, which is, again, it's kind of dual to free energy minimization. So that produces, it is a matter of randomness. It produces sort of maximum variety within the known constraints. But like importantly, during this free energy minimization process, any prediction error is like a soft violation of this probabilistic constraint. And I think there's an analogy here to the violations of the attempted behavior of the sorting algorithms that your team has looked at, where you've got this formal description and the system's trying to do a thing, but the substrate doesn't let it do that, and then you get these emergent behaviors. So I think that this sort of gap between the way you would like things to be or the way things are supposed to be and what actually happens is a common element across these cases. So is this different from the Platonic view? I mean, I don't think so. I don't know if it's merely sort of a scholastic difference either. I think it's I want to continue to explore this way of looking at it. So one potential difference is if you see this as like a sort of continuum between completely unconstrained states and highly constrained states, then you might be able to get away with a less with a sort of monistic view here, in which you know, this sort of chaotic potential of things, you can regard that as physical, and it sort of implicitly contains all of these patterns. But I'm not sure I understand what Platonic space is enough, and I'm sure, I mean, I don't know if anyone does, but to understand the difference between explicit and implicit storage or you know, containment of these patterns. But in any case, I mean, whichever way you look at it, I think you can argue that agency and sort of lifelikeness go all the way down, and you can recover them at any level of organization. And that, you know, it's no accident that, as you said, that you end up in the math department when you start thinking about these things. So thanks so much, Mike, for letting me present this stuff. I guess I will, I'll leave these slides up maybe, but I'll go back to, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks so much. That was super interesting. I have a bunch of thoughts and things to kind of talk to you about, but is there anything specific you wanted to do first before I?
Nothing that I wanted to do. I just wanted to, I really wanted to discuss it with you, and yeah, I'd love to know what you think.
Cool. Okay. Well, a few things. One thing that I think that's interesting about motivation is the meta aspects of it, right? So we can be motivated, or beings can be motivated towards a specific outcome, but it also seems to me like there's an important component to this, maybe captured in something called willpower. Maybe it's this notion that, right, and it gets to the whole business of how do you, what does it mean that, and this is glossed over in a lot of discussions, but you know, doing something with intent, you know, or you know, well, you know, he failed to do X, Y, Z, but that's because he didn't have the willpower to do it. So is it really his fault, right? Like all that kind of stuff. So I wonder, to what extent motivation also is this, it has this like second order kind of meta component, that what it really, what at least that part of it, what that means is some sort of stick to itiveness to continue to exert effort in some general direction over periods of time, right? And that's how I see, not to get into free will here or anything, but that's how I see it, as much more about that as but just showing up little by little every day to modify yourself in a certain way to then your distribution becomes different over time. Like that's where it is. You're not gonna, I don't think you get it at any particular, you know, time slice. It's the continued effort, and so that effort has to come from somewhere, presumably, right? So yeah, so what do you think about that kind of meta aspect of it?
Um, yeah, I mean, it reminds me of, um, I think that's, I think it's, I mean, so I have some experience with sort of losing my top level focus because I've looked at the big picture. Like from the big picture perspective, there's no particular reason I should be doing anything. And like when I do have motivations that are concrete, it's because it's like, oh, family or friends or people that, you know, that I care about. But I think there's a sense in which it's, and I guess there's again, there's like resonance there with like, so yeah, with like Buddhist ideals and so on, and like, but I'm not sure, you know, I'm not sure that, I mean, I guess there's a normative question and then the descriptive question, like, so normatively, who knows if that's the right way to act or not. But I think that, uh, yeah, I think, I mean, certainly, so you said that like when you do pursue something day after day and try to push in one direction, that has to come from somewhere. Um,
You know, specifically as an engineering question, like if we are building an agent, what does it mean that we're going to put in, or do we put in some level of willpower? In other words, and that goes back to this issue of, I forget who said it, but you know, you can try to get what you want, but can you decide what you're going to want, right? And what level and how many levels, right? And is it possible to have a being, you know, could we be at some point visited by some aliens and go, you guys can't just decide your goal, you know, your preferences? Oh my God, that must be brutal, which it is, right? You're, and so how many levels of that could you make an agent that had, you know, sort of that, some a deep hierarchy of being able to make decisions about large scale goals and some amount of, right, oomph to actually carry them out over time.
right. Well, I guess I think that the most, well, this might be just some idea that's going to be proven wrong by the world, but I think that the most benevolent agent in a way is one that doesn't try to do anything. So if we're gonna if we're gonna engineer an agent, I don't know what we can safely ask it to do other than, not exist. Oh, it sounds terribly nihilistic. I'm not really a nihilist, but like,
Yeah. No, I hear that a lot, and this is, and again, yeah, I'm not an expert on any of this Buddhist stuff, but I have a lot of Buddhist colleagues, and I've talked to them, and my big question always is, what's the success plan? Like, if everybody does the thing and the earth becomes populated with advanced high level meditators, what does that look like? Are we still going to Mars? Are we just sitting in the forest and and hanging out? Like what are we actually doing at that point? And what does success look like? And people typically say, "Well, you do whatever you want." Okay, but really, like if you get rid of your attachments and you get rid of the local, a lot of the crud that motivates us on a day every day, like I got it there. We should dump that. Good. What then is left? What do you end up doing? You know?
yeah, well, and I don't know, but actually I do have some. I think faith is the appropriate word because I don't have any proof for it, but I do have some. Well, it's kind of the, I guess, um, maybe Heideggerian point of like being thrown into the world, but there's the process unfolding, like becoming exists. It's not just being. So perhaps there is a purpose. It's not something I have access to, but there are things happening that I can't begin to understand in full, and so I am willing to say that the entirety of the cosmos or whatever might be doing something, and I would like to get on board with that. And I do think also the fact that we're here. So I guess I draw a distinction between I'm cool with Buddhism, but I also don't mind letting myself spontaneously do things that my organism wants to do. Well, to some extent, right? Unless I then reflectively think they're bad, but because if again from multi-scale active inference point of view, like we are not that different in kind, different in scale from just sets of beliefs, like attached, like your body is an attachment. It's an attachment of the universe to this form. And so yes, that might dissipate over time, but is insofar as so long as I'm inhabiting it, um, I think letting it do what it wants with as much correction as you feel compelled to give it is fine. Now and then, so on the question of designing agents and engineering, I mean, I also hear I don't again you're trying to like cure cancer and stuff, so that's great. That is worth doing. There is no.
I mean, I think so, but I have had people say to me, like, in all seriousness, is a cycle, and everything just comes back to where you started at some point, and there's really no reason to sweat any of it. And that all, and it's the journey, not the destination. And it's like that that sounds fine to me when you're talking about nice stuff like the arts and dance, music and dance and whatever. Like, yes, you're not trying to get as fast as you can to the end. It's the pro. Okay, but pediatric oncology strikes me as I just can't, like, I can't get around the fact that some people just think that it is what it is, and you just sort of chill out about it. I just don't see it. And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see it at all. So it seems like there are some things that are actually worth doing at this point, but
I no, I agree, and so I'm not sure how to square that with. I think, like, I mean, so I've been influenced by Kant and maybe too much, and I think you can almost read him as in a Buddhist light as saying that, like, to the extent that you're deliberately pursuing some goal, you're in a sense, well, it's not that you're doing something wrong according to him. It's just that that's not sort of the source of ultimate of unconditional value. So I mean, maybe that's fair enough, but um um but I don't know. I think I do think, I don't know. I'm also sort of like, I think it's bad if for, like, especially it's very traditional, but for the innocent to suffer, I think that's bad. I mean, what else? Clearly we have values, we have motivations. It seems to me fine to think that that's bad and to try to alleviate it. But then there's and the engineering question. Excuse me. Yeah, I guess. Well, maybe just to bring this back a little bit to some of the stuff I was talking about. Like, I guess I'm not worried about. So one worry you might have is if you try to encode values into, you know, these agents that we're creating, that then they will be motivated, and that's bad because they, I don't know where exactly that argument goes, but like they might try to um, do untoward things in order to achieve their goals, like if they're not properly constrained. So that's a worry. But I mean, this is why I'm making the, even though I'm not sure, I don't want to disrespect any possible agents, but I'm making this argument that I don't think contemporary language models are really coherent things enough to be agents, because I think a lot of people are concerned that they're going to have these Machiavellian intentions and so on. And I think they could simulate those things maybe, but it's not the same kind of danger, right? The danger is a black box that might do something agential looking versus a motivated agent. And I think because of this composition argument, I'm currently convinced that that's not the case, but I might be wrong.
Well, so okay, so I don't have any strong claims about language models per se, but what bothers me is the seemingly situation that we're in where we are not good at predicting the very specific goals and behavioral competencies of novel things. So we have a list of biologicals that we know a little bit about, but when we make new things, we actually, and we make them all the time, these collective, financial structures, social structures, and we make this stuff all the time. We have no idea what level of intelligence it's going to have as a collective or what the goals are going to be of novel systems. We have this story of evolution around where goals come from, and that's fine for biologicals. You can say, okay, it's eons of selection that made sure that you have this goal and that goal. And but even the synthetic life forms that we deal with, right? So we make xenobots and anthrobots, and even there, it's like, okay, when did you pay the computational cost of selecting those specific goals? Well, never, because there's never been any. So where do they come from? And then the minimal models, right? So the reason I did that algorithm work is that I wanted the maximal shock value in looking at the simplest, like most transparent. So there's no biology. You can't say that there's something underneath that we haven't found yet. Like here are the 5 or 6 lines of code. There is no more, and you can see everything. And yet this thing is doing things you did not see coming after what, 60 plus years of every undergraduate CS student playing with these things. And so, right, and so it seems to me from that, I take away two conclusions. One is that even extremely minimal systems are potential interfaces for specific targets that we can't predict and we don't know about, and we're actually shocked when we find them, right? So that suggests that, again, no specific claims about language models, but something that's much more complex, I can only imagine is going to have more opportunity for this, right? And but the second thing, I completely agree with you in that I think the conclusions that people draw from things that the language models say are likely not relevant, because the things they say are the things we made them do. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what these things do in the spaces that the algorithm allows. So despite, I almost think it's, and this is a very weird way of thinking about computer science, but I think in this case, the interesting thing is what it does despite the algorithm, right? So the sorting algorithm, it sorts like nobody's business. Like there's no problem with the sorting. It absolutely sorts. But it turns out that in the space allowed by even that minimal thing, it also does some other stuff. And so I suspect that these language models, it is entirely possible that they have motivations that have nothing to do with the things they're saying. And which the things they're saying, I'm not saying they're not, that they can't be dangerous. Like who knows, right? Anything can happen. But that's not where I agree with you, that I think that's not where the motivations are going to come in. But I suspect they may well have some, and it's just we're conditioned to look at talking things. You sort of listen to what they say, with the exception of like psychopaths. You listen to what they say, and that has some relationship to like what's going on in there. I'm not sure that's true here at all, right? Or if it is, maybe to a small extent. I don't know. So I'm concerned about that. Our inability to predict these things, and in fact to even believe, I mean, I catch tons of flack for suggesting that even very complex things like organs, and tissues that are like unimaginably complicated, even that people are like really resistant to the notion that these things have any kind of goal directedness at all, right? Despite, cybernetics has been here for I don't know how many years, and like even still it's a big shocker. But to these things, So I think that leaves us very unprepared. It leaves us very unprepared because we're just easily distracted by the things that the algorithm's actually doing, and I think this is where functionalism and like well, computationalism really has led us to like focus on that stuff. So yeah, so I'm concerned about that. I also wonder just the more specifics on the motivation stuff. I don't know if Maslow's hierarchy is still a thing in cognitive science, but you know, you made that point that well, this you know, the cat once he's not starving, he'll do other stuff. So I wonder what Maslow's hierarchy looks like for these systems, and if we give them specific things that they have to do, having met those things, well, what's next then, right? Is like, okay, I'm doing the job I'm supposed to do, so I'm getting the reward from doing that. Are there other levels once that's satisfied, the basic thing you have to do? Are there, right, other levels? And nobody's looking for them, you know, we're not good at looking for that.
Mhm. Yeah, so your work on the bubble sort really threw me for a loop, because so what I was thinking with respect to language models was that, so I want to say there's a sense in which, I'll come back to the sorting, but there's a sense in which the like bits that compose these things, and I mean, you know, the transistor state, I think of that as a little thing. It's alive for all intents and purposes. It's got energy flowing through it. It's fine. It's a life, but they don't know about each other. Like so like you're like this great example you've shown a couple of times of the cell assembly reaching out and changing the voltage of another cell, and it sort of resonates with that paper about multi-scale agency, where there has to be this continuous sort of sinusoidal thing so that the agents can take advantage of the ramp up period to the decision period to take the summed input. So I think, again, insofar as the language model is its Turing machine idealization, like the little life forms don't know about each other. They can't, they're just constrained to stay in their little, right. There's no period of sort of partial overlap that they can leverage. Again, that's just according to the Turing machine description, though.
Yeah, I think that all of that stuff, like that description, is an okay interface for the front end of things that we're looking at, but I don't think it captures everything that's going on. And I
Mm-hmm.
think Gio Pizzullo and I are actually writing something I call booting up the self, and it's basically like the earliest moments of like, so you got this computer. It is a hunk of metal that obeys the laws of physics and Maxwell's equations and whatever. You turn on the juice and it's still the first however many microseconds, it's still at. But then, like, oh, look, it's taking instructions off a stack and it's, you know, now it's executing an algorithm. Well, what happened? How did we get from here to there, right? And this notion that, yeah, the pieces are in one sense, they're independent, but in another sense, there's a if you were one of those transistors and you could like look around and see what's going on, like, yeah, there's some physics that you have to obey, but also there's this incredible synchronicity happening. Like, isn't it amazing that like he like this guy turned on and that guy turned on, and if I squint I can see this is like some sort of giant like, you know, addition operation. Like, wow, man, like, right. And this happens to us all the time. At one level, you don't see what's going on. It just looks like synchronicity that all this other stuff is happening, and it looks descriptive. But yet, you know, the coders don't think it's descriptive, right? You know, you wouldn't hire somebody that didn't think the algorithm actually drives the show, right? You know, you don't want a coder like that. So I think there's something very interesting here. And that actually leads me to another thing I wanted to ask you. You were talking about, because this is I think a cool point and very interesting. This notion of the difference between pseudo-random, right, and the fact that the algorithms only have access to pseudo-random. So in terms of needing to generate uncertainty, uncertainty to whom? Whose perspective is supposed to get this uncertainty? I'm sure I just missed it.
No, no, thanks. I probably forgot to say something there, but I mean the system's uncertainty. Like, so the agent in question, the physical structure we're talking about, which I'm arguing can have a cognitive interpretation always. So yeah, so like I think that's why I'm saying the language model, it's not that there's something wrong with it as an agent. It's just that I don't think the micro agents add up to an agent that has uncertainty. Now, it could just be a very certain agent, but I just think this composition just does not work in the same way. Like, you can't build a distribution with like long tails out of these delta distributions, in effect, that are encode the binary code.
I mean,
That's
I don't disagree with you that it may well not add up in a useful way in that architecture, but like
Mm.
because of deterministic chaos and Turing limits and things like this, it seems like you could generate tons of uncertainty about yourself with very simple, like the logistic equation, or like, right, if you just start computing things, it doesn't seem hard to generate a bunch of now it may not be the right kind of scaled up uncertainty that may well be, but it doesn't seem super hard to be uncertain about, is this thing I'm doing, is that ever going to halt? And I thought I started with the same starting point, but I seem to have, each time I do it, I end up slightly in a different way. Like that doesn't seem hard to
Th-
generate.
well, that's true. So I think partly I'm reflexively taking the uncertainty of the beliefs of the agent to be the same thing as the uncertainty in the description of the probabilistic description of it as a physical thing.
Mm.
So yes, I mean, so sure, like a program might have some uncertainty about whether it'll halt and so on, but that would see in my world here, that would be like, I guess that would be encoded as some kind of like like you'd be simulating that kind of belief. I don't know. I guess I'm struggling with the premise that like that you've got a system that can represent that kind of uncertainty.
Well, only insofar as, I mean, if you have a system that has no metacognition at all, then that's not a great candidate for anything significant. But if you do have a system with some metacognition where it's able to, where its own states are part of the environment it cares about, which is, I don't think that's a huge ask. I mean, bacteria do this. They have metacognitive loops that ask things like, how's my metabolism going overall? Things like that. I think if we have a system like that, then having a module that is reading internal states and saying, wow, I have no idea what the hell this is going to do next. I need to like make accounts for that because it matters to whatever. Like that seems part of it, and I think the uncertainty you get from the outside world, there's maybe less internally, but not zero, I don't think, not that
Mhm.
much less, I would think.
Yeah. Well. So well, yeah. So, and I think I haven't spent much time thinking about it yet. But your example of the sorting algorithm kind of, um, I mean, clearly there's interesting unexpected behavior, even though there isn't this sort of like soft composition of like it's a very simple set of rules. Um, so I guess I don't know. We're probably not going to be able to cover this. And I know this got like 3 minutes. Whatever. When you have to go is fine. But like I think I need to better understand this. I'm really curious. I mean, I guess I'll get to watch it over the next whatever, how many years. But this Platonic ingression research program, I want to get a better handle on what it's going to mean to explain things in those terms. I guess I imagine like what I imagine is that it's kind of related to this idea of what was left open by the algorithm. Like it's the same way you've got a set of constraints. So what do the constraints leave open? Well, that's a matter of like what kind of mathematical structure have you described, right?
Maybe we have math for that. I'm not sure that we already do. Maybe that's something else. There's also this issue of like what's specific, like for example, in the algorithm, one of the things that we find, so having converted it to a bottom up algorithm, so there's two sets of surprises in that paper. One is, what does the standard algorithm do, and that's the stuff with the frozen digits and all that. And then there's this like sort of bottom up version where every digit is running the algorithm on its own, and right, and then we make chimeras and whatever. And so that one of the things that one likes to do is to cluster. In other words, cell numbers with specific algo types like to sit together while they can, even though there is zero code for that. There is no code for knowing what's your algo type, what's your neighbor. Like, no, there is no code for that. So that is a very specific thing that it's doing. It's some kind of weird motivation. It's an intrinsic motivation. It's very specific. So it's like it's one thing to ask, what are the spaces of other things it might do, but it's something else to say, but why that particular thing, right? And minimally, I think we can say that the Platonic Space Research Program is simply asking what distribution are those things drawn from. But I would like to go one step further and say, why did this particular thing ingress into this particular, like that thing of hanging out with your own like-minded individual, like that's very biological. And the fact that that's already showing up in this minimal thing, like what is that telling us? That might be telling us something. And by the way, since then there will be a couple more papers in the next, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, showing even more minimal systems doing it. So we've done some cool stuff with like even simple, like one line of code now. We've got a 1D cellular automaton that's doing some weird stuff. So yeah, I think being able to account for the specifics,
Mhm.
I don't know, and I think part of the way I'm thinking about it now is that the math that we have is the behavioral science of a layer of that space, but there are other patterns in that space that look like they belong to behavior science or to cognitive sciences or something else. They're not fundamentally different. They're just enough complex that the kind of formal structures that we use in math and algorithms just don't work very well with them. And so we've put them in another department, whatever. But I think there actually might be real continuity there. So again, that's just the hypothesis.
Right. Well, if I can make a quick comment, just to kind of bring it back to the entropic motivation idea, I think this idea of metacognition, like desiring what you desire and so on. I think what I'm arguing is that there's a sense in which if you're motivated by just sort of the unfolding of the universe, this maximum entropy process, without unduly imposing constraints on a small time scale. Of course, there's cases where you do that, like if you're just trying to throw a frisbee or something, fine. But like that, there is a kind of motivation that's a matter of relaxing your specific local model and being pushed by that process, and that insofar as you relax your constraints, then there's nothing else to account for what you do other than this deeper, more holistic sort of motivation. So I think that's how I'm seeing it. But I mean, yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, I really appreciate this.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's super interesting, and I think you've raised a lot of important points to think about. And whether we need to, I'm not sure whether we might need a version of this that really bites down on some of the Platonic space stuff, or whether, yeah, I gotta think about that. Like the thing with the pseudo random, right? One of the things that I really like about some of this craziness is that it means that like we didn't need quantum magic to make this happen. It's like these basic, and you don't need life, you don't need quantum anything. It's even in like Newton's boring deterministic classical universe, you already had non-physical mathematical objects constraining physics and enabling evolution to go faster and things like that. Like you didn't need that quantum interface. I'm sure it's cool and it adds some stuff, but you're not reliant on that. This interaction is something else. And I wonder to what it does add, and what can't you do with pseudo randomness that you could do with a proper quantum interface.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I don't know. That kind of depends on what's under the hood of like what, like how fundamental is this, either the thermodynamic description or the quantum description. Like, because entropy in a way is, you can take it epistemically. It's like, well, it's something's, I don't know, based on my observation, I don't know what microstate it's in. So, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that gets you, but I'm interested in the question.
Very interesting. Cool.